It barrels inside, and Wemby is going to get called for the goaltending. Now, as Lively looks ready to go on the alley-oop.
Everyone agrees Victor Wembanyama is the future of the NBA. But here's the question nobody is comfortable asking yet. What if Cooper Flagg ends up being better? Not more hyped, not more viral, actually better. Because while Wembanyama looks like something the league has never seen before, something almost unnatural, Cooper Flagg is doing something that might be even more dangerous. He is making elite basketball look simple. And that is where things get uncomfortable. Because the NBA has always struggled with this exact type of player. The one who does not overwhelm you immediately, but slowly takes control of everything. And if you think this is just another prospect debate, it is not. This is about how we define greatness in real time. It is about hype versus control, ceiling versus reliability, chaos versus structure. And if you are the kind of fan who thinks the obvious answer is always the right one, you might want to subscribe now, because this story keeps flipping the deeper you go. Now on the surface, this comparison should not even exist. Victor Wembanyama entered the league as the most anticipated prospect since LeBron James. 7'4", guard skills, shot blocking numbers that look fake, a player who could erase possessions without even jumping. From the moment he stepped onto an NBA floor, everything confirmed the hype. Over 20 points per game, around 10 rebounds, nearly 4 blocks. He did not just impact games, he bent them. Every highlight felt like proof that the future had already arrived. And then there is Cooper Flagg. No alien, no impossible wingspan that breaks defensive schemes just by standing there. Instead, a 6'9" forward who came out of Maine, dominated high, took over Duke, and then quietly became the #1 pick in 2025. Quietly is the key word. Because even after going first overall, the conversation never felt the same. There was excitement, but not fear. Respect, but not disbelief. And that difference matters more than people realize. Because from the beginning, these two were never competing in the same. Wembanyama dominates moments, Flagg controls sequence. One explodes onto your screen, the other reshapes what is happening possession after possession. Early numbers seem to confirm that split. Wembanyama looked historic, the kind of rookie stat line that gets compared to legends immediately. Defensive impact that turned entire offenses hesitant. Flagg looked balanced. Around 20 points per game, solid rebounds, playmaking flashes, efficient decisions. Nothing that screamed impossible, but nothing that broke either. And that is exactly why people underestimated him. Because stability in a league obsessed with highlights gets mistaken for limitation. But here is the first shift that changes everything. Stability at 19 years old is not normal. Control at that age is not safe. It is disruptive. Because when a player already understands tempo, spacing, decision-making, and how to adjust to chaos, it means one thing. He is not learning the game. He is already manipulating it, and that is where the comparison with Wembanyama starts to break down. Because while Wemby forces the game to react to him, Flagg reads, processes it, and then quietly dictates what happens next. That does not show up in a single highlight. But it shows up everywhere else, in possessions that do not collapse, in teammates who suddenly look better, in games that feel controlled even when the score is close, and yet, despite all of that, the narrative stayed the same. Wembanyama is the generational one, Flagg is the safe one, and for a while that made sense. Until you start asking the uncomfortable question. If one player is already this composed, this adaptable, this efficient, in a broken situation, what happens when everything actually works around him? Because that is the part nobody had an answer for yet. And that uncertainty is where this story stops being simple. Because once you realize that both players are not just different, but almost opposite in how they impact winning, the debate is no longer about talent. It becomes about which style survives pressure. And that is where things start to get complicated. Cooper Flagg was never supposed to look this comfortable this early. That was the first assumption. Top picks usually need time. They need structure. They need a system that slowly teaches them how to survive in the NBA. Flagg did not get any of that. He was dropped into a situation that made no sense. The Mavericks were unstable. The rotations changed constantly. The offense lacked identity. At times, he was even asked to handle the ball like a primary guard, something that was never supposed to be his role this early. And yet he still produced not just flashes, not just isolated moments, consistent production. Around 20 points per game, efficient decisions, defensive versatility, playmaking that kept improving every week. On the surface, that sounds like a success story. But that is exactly where the problem begins. Because when a player performs this well inside chaos, you lose your ability to measure him correctly. Is he thriving because he is great? Or is he just surviving better than everyone else? That question matters. Because if the environment improves, his numbers might explode, or they might stay the same, revealing that what we thought was a ceiling was actually just, and that uncertainty creates tension, because now the conversation shifts from what he is doing to what he could, and that is always more dangerous. But while Flagg was quietly solving problems around him, Wembanyama was doing the opposite. He was creating problems for everyone else. Every night, defenses had to adjust just to exist. Drivers hesitated, shooters rushed. Coaches redesigned sets just to avoid him. He was not just playing defense, he was changing behavior. And that kind of impact is rare, because it shows up before the stat sheet even updates. But here is the twist that changes how you look at everything. Dominance is not the same as control. Wembanyama can take over possessions in ways that feel impossible. He can block shots that should not be reachable. He can score in ways that ignore normal defensive logic. But control is different. Control is knowing when to slow the game down. Control is deciding which possession matters. Control is making sure your team does not collapse when things get chaotic. And that is where Flagg starts starts to separate in a way that is harder to... Because while Wemby forces reactions, Flagg manages outcome. That difference does not always show up in highlights, but it shows up when games tighten. It shows up when the fourth quarter turns messy. It shows up when possessions start to matter more than talent. And this is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Because the league has always celebrated dominance first, the louder player, the more visible impact, the one who makes you stop and stare. But winning does not always follow that path. Winning often follows control, and that is where the stakes rise. Because now the question is no longer about who looks better. It becomes about which style translates when everything is on the line, and that is where the pressure begins to build. Because once expectations start to form, they do not stay neutral. They pick sides, and slowly, without anyone saying it directly, the conversation started to shift. Wembanyama was still seen as the future, but Flagg was becoming something else. A variable, something harder to predict, something harder to define, and that is always more dangerous. Because you cannot prepare for what you do not fully understand. But what made the situation even more complicated was how quickly things escalated. Because just when it felt like Flagg was settling into a consistent role, something unexpected. The scoring jumped, not gradually, not predictably, suddenly. Games where he was not just efficient, but aggressive. Moments where he stopped blending into the flow and started bending it. And that is when the narrative began to crack. Because now the safe prospect was not just stable anymore, he was becoming explosive, and that changes everything. Because once a player shows he can do both control and take over, the entire evaluation shifts. Now you're not asking if he can survive, you are asking how far this can go. And that question is where comparisons become dangerous. Because once you introduce ceiling into the conversation, everything accelerates. Expectations rise, criticism sharpens, and every performance starts to carry more weight than it should. And that is exactly what happened next. Because just as Flagg started to look like more than a system player, the situation around him refused to improve. And that is where things started to break. Not in his game, in the narrative around it. And that changed the story completely. And then it happened. The stretch that forced everyone to pay attention. 4 straight games with over 30 points. Not empty scoring, not random explosions, controlled dominance. And suddenly, the comparisons, because this was not normal rookie production. This was historic territory. The youngest player to do it since Michael Jordan and Allen Iverson. That is not just a stat. That is a statement. Because when your name starts appearing next to players like that, the conversation does not stay. It explodes. Media narratives flipped almost overnight. The same analysts who called him safe started calling him special. The same scouts who questioned his ceiling started revisiting their evaluation, and fans started asking the question that nobody wanted to ask too early. Is he actually on the same level as Wembanyama? And for the first time, that question did not feel ridiculous. Because now Flagg was not just controlling games. He was taking them over. He was creating his own offense, attacking mismatches, punishing defensive mistakes, and doing it without losing the structure that made him so effective in the first place. That combination is rare, because most players either dominate or control. Very few can do both. But here's where the twist hits harder than expected, despite all of that. Despite the scoring, despite the efficiency, despite the historic run, the Mavericks were still losing. And that changed everything, because in the NBA, numbers without wins always come with consequences. It does not matter how young you are. It does not matter how impressive the stats look. If the team is not winning, the narrative will find a way to turn. And it did. The same performances that looked like a breakout suddenly started to look like a question. Is this real impact or just production? And that distinction is brutal, because production can be explained. Impact has to be proven. And now Flagg was being pushed into a different conversation. Not as a prospect, but as a leader, and that is a completely different level of pressure, because leading a team is not about what you can do. It is about what changes when you do it. Do teammates improve? Does the offense stabilize? Does the team win more games? And in this case, the answer was not clear, which is exactly why the narrative became dangerous. Because now every great performance came with a second layer, not just how good it looked, but why it was not translating. And this is where careers start to shift. Because once doubt enters the conversation, it does not leave easily. It grows, it spreads, and it changes how everything is interpreted. A 30-point game becomes expected instead of impressive. A loss becomes evidence instead of context. And suddenly, the same stretch that elevated his reputation started to come. Because expectations rose faster than results. And that gap is where criticism lives. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because Wembanyama never had to deal with this exact version of his impact was obvious. Defensive dominance translates immediately. It shows up in wins, in highlights, and fear from opponents. But Flagg's impact required something more. Time, structure, consistency from the system around him. And when those things are missing, the perception shifts. Not because the player is worse, but because the results are harder to see. And that is exactly what happened. Because while Flagg was proving he could carry scoring loads, the team around him was not keeping up. Rotations broke down, spacing disappeared, defensive lapses from others erased his contributions, and none of that shows up next to his name. All that shows up is the record, and the record was not good, which leads to the next shift in the story. Because now the conversation was no longer about potential, it was about responsibility. And that is where young stars either grow or get labeled early. Because once people start asking if you can actually carry a team, The expectations changed. You are no longer developing. You are being judged. And this is where the comparison with Wembanyama becomes sharper. Because now it is not just about who is better. It is about who translates faster, who impacts winning sooner, who forces the league to adjust immediately. And for a moment, it felt like the answer was clear. Wembanyama. Because dominance is easier to recognize than control. But what made the situation even more complicated was what came next. Because instead of shrinking under that pressure, Flagg responded in a way that changed the entire conversation. And this time, it was not about scoring. It was about something much harder to ignore. The moment the narrative started turning against him, something shifted, not in the headlines, not in the highlights, and how he played the game. Because instead of chasing numbers, instead of trying to silence the criticism with more scoring, Flagg did something most young players never do. He adjusted, he slowed the game down, he started reading defenses instead of reacting to them. Possessions became cleaner, decisions became sharper, teammates started getting easier looks. And slowly, the numbers that people ignored began to rise. Assist totals climbed, turnovers dropped, efficiency stabilized even under pressure. This was not a flashy transformation, it was subtle, but it changed everything. Because now the argument that he was just putting up empty stats started to collapse. You cannot fake control. You cannot fake the ability to organize a game at this level. And the more he leaned into that role, the more the identity became clear. He was not trying to outshine Wembanyama. He was becoming something else entirely. A player who could dictate how the game unfolds. And that is where the media split got even less. Because now the debate had two completely different directions. One side leaned into dominance. They pointed at Wembanyama's defensive presence, his shot blocking, the way he could erase entire possessions without touching the ball. They argued that kind of impact is generated, that you cannot teach size like that. You cannot replicate that disruption. And in their eyes, that made the conversation simple. Wembanyama is the better player. The other side pushed back. They argued that basketball is not just about moments, it is about sequences. It is about control. They pointed at Flagg's ability to manage possessions, to make the right decision repeatedly, to keep the game from breaking down, and they asked a different question. What matters more in winning basketball? Chaos or structure? And suddenly, this was not just a player comparison anymore. It was a philosophical divide, and that divide only got sharper as the season continued. Because while Flagg was improving his control, the team around him was getting worse. Losses stacked up. The Mavericks slipped 19 wins, 32 losses. Near the bottom of the Western Conference. And even though the context was obvious, injuries, inconsistency, roster imbalance, the narrative did not care. It never does. Because when you are the number one pick, you do not get patience. You get pressure. And slowly, the blame started to shift, not directly, not openly, but it was there. Questions about leadership, questions about impact, questions about whether his style actually translates to winning. And that is where things started to get uncomfortable. Because this is how early labels are formed. Not from truth, from perception. And once a player gets labeled, it follows them. Every game becomes confirmation. Every mistake becomes evidence. And this is where the comparison with Wembanyama turned ugly. Because now it was not just about it was about who was delivering. Wembanyama's presence still felt undeniable. Even in losses, his impact looked overwhelming. You could see it, you could feel it, and that visibility matters, because it shapes how people interpret success. Flagg's impact was quieter, more controlled, less obvious. And in a league driven by perception, that becomes a problem. Because if people cannot immediately see what you are doing, they start questioning if it matters. And that is exactly what happened. The conversation shifted again, not about potential, not about ceiling, about can he actually carry a team? Can his style hold up under real pressure? Can control win at the highest level? And those questions are heavy, because they do not go away with one good game. They require sustained proof. And this is where many young players start to crack, because the weight of expectation does not just come from performance, it comes from narrative. And the narrative around Flagg was becoming unstable, not because he was failing, but because the situation around him was, and that is a dangerous place to be. Because when team failure overlaps with individual growth, the story becomes confused. People stop seeing progress. They start seeing inconsistency, and that can stall a career before it even begins. But here's where things take another turn, because instead of letting that narrative define him, Flagg responded again. And this time, it was not just about adjusting his game. It was about redefining his role entirely, because once the questions about leadership became loud enough, he stopped playing like a scorer and started playing like a leader who could control everything. And that changed the story once more. And that shift was not loud. It did not show up in a single viral moment. It showed up in how everything around him started to stabilize. Because once Flagg fully embraced that role, the game slowed down in a way that forced people to reconsider what they were watching. He was not chasing dominance anymore. He was orchestrating, bringing the ball up with purpose, calling out adjustments before the defense even reacted, moving teammates into positions where they could succeed without thinking. And slowly, the chaos around him started to look less chaotic. Not because the roster suddenly improved, because he was controlling it. Assist numbers continued to rise. Decision-making became almost mechanical in its precision. Late-game possessions stopped feeling rushed. And for the first time, there was a different kind of conversation happening. Not about whether he could score, but about whether he could run a team, and that is a completely different level of value. Because scoring wins games, but control wins seasons. And once that idea entered the discussion, everything shifted again. Because now, the comparison with Wembanyama was no longer about who can dominate. It was about who you would trust. Trust to close games, trust to manage pressure, trust to make the right decision when everything breaks down, and that is where things get complicated, because Wembanyama still had the higher ceiling. That was never in question. His ability to take over a game in ways that feel impossible still existed. The blocks, the length, the moments where he looks like he is playing a different sport. But trust is not built on moments. It is built on consistency, and that is where Flagg was quietly gaining ground. Because night after night, even in losses, he looked composed, he looked in control. He looked like someone who understood what was happening before it happened. And that creates a different kind of pressure. Because now the expectation changes again. You are no longer judged as a rookie, you are judged as a foundation. And that weight is heavy. Because once a player becomes the foundation of a team, every weakness gets magnified. Every loss becomes a reflection of your leadership. Every mistake becomes a question about your ceiling. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable again. Because even as Flagg improved, even as his role expanded, the results wins did not suddenly appear. The standings did not suddenly shift. And that creates a new tension. Because now you have a player who looks like he can control everything, but still cannot fix everything. And that gap is dangerous, because it invites a different kind of criticism, not about talent, about limits. Is this as far as it goes? Is this style enough? Can control alone carry a team deep into the playoffs? And those questions do not have easy answers, because history does not give you a clear pattern. Some players with this style become champions. Others become consistent, but never dominant enough to break through. And that uncertainty is where the comparison flips again. Because now, Wembanyama's chaos starts to look more appealing. Because chaos can overwhelm, chaos can break systems, chaos can create advantages that control cannot always manufacture. And that is the tension at the center of this entire debate. Do you choose the player who guarantees structure, or the player who can destroy it? And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to answer. Because both paths have risks. Wembanyama's style depends on physical dominance. And history has shown that physical dominance can injuries, fatigue, adjustments from the league, things that reduce the gap. Flagg's style depends on decision-making, and decision-making evolves. It improves, it adapts. It becomes harder to disrupt over time, and that is where the long-term question starts to emerge. Not who is better right now, but who becomes more reliable over time. Because in the NBA, reliability is power. The ability to show up the same way every night. The ability to adjust when defenses figure you out. The ability to remain effective even when your strengths are targeted. And that is where Flagg might have the edge. Not in how high he can go, but in how long he can stay there. And that idea changes the entire conversation, because now you are not just comparing talent, you are comparing trajectories. And trajectories define legacies, because the league does not remember who looked the most impressive at 19. It remembers who sustained greatness, who adapted, who lasted. And that is where the real question begins to, what if being less spectacular early is exactly what allows you to become more dominant? And that is where this story stops being about two players. It starts becoming about how greatness actually works, because what comes next is not about stats. It is not about highlights. It is about something much harder to measure and much harder to predict. And that is what makes this comparison so dangerous. And this is where everything flips one last time, because up until this point, the debate has been framed the wrong way. It was never just about who is better. It was about who we understand better. Wembanyama is easy to explain. He dominates physically. He alters games instantly. He creates highlights that confirm everything you believed before the game even started. You watch him for 5 minutes and you already know what he is. That kind of clarity is powerful. It builds hype. It builds confidence. It builds a narrative that feels undeniable. But Cooper Flagg is different, because the more you watch him, the less simple the answer becomes. At first he looks safe, then he looks complete, then he looks like a system player, then suddenly he looks like the system itself. And that progression is what makes him dangerous, because players like that do not peak early. They evolve, they add layers, they adapt faster than the league can define them. And that is where history starts to whisper something uncomfortable. The most dominant player is not always the one who controls the league long term. Sometimes it is the one who understands it best. Because dominance can be challenged, but understanding is much harder to break. And if you follow that logic, the question changes completely. It is no longer about whether Flagg can reach Wembanyama's ceiling. It is about whether Wembanyama can maintain his advantage as the league adjusts. Because the NBA always adjusts. Defenses evolve, schemes change, teams study every tendency. And when that happens, players are forced to reveal what they rely on most. For Wembanyama, that might be physical dominance. For Flagg, it is decision-making. And those two paths age very differently. Because physical advantages can shrink, decision-making usually grows, and that is where the long-term stakes become clear. Because if Flagg continues on this trajectory, if he keeps refining how he reads, how he controls tempo, how he elevates teammates, then the comparison stops being about talent entirely. It becomes about sustainability. And sustainability decides legacies. Because the league is full of players who looked unstoppable early, but could not maintain it. It is also full of players who never looked overwhelming, but ended up controlling eras. And that is the tension at the center of this story. One player might always look more impressive. The other might quietly become more effective. And if that happens, the entire narrative flips. Because then the question is no longer who is more gifted. It becomes who you would choose to build around for the next decade. And that is not an easy answer, because choosing Wembanyama means betting on something we have never really seen before. A player whose physical profile breaks traditional logic. A player who can dominate in ways that feel unfair. but also unpredictable. Because players like that come with variables the league has never fully seen. Choosing Flagg means betting on something more familiar, but also more reliable. A player who fits into any system, but can also become the system. A player who does not overwhelm immediately, but slowly removes every weakness from it. And that is where the real danger lies. Because while everyone is focused on how high Wembanyama can go, Flagg might be building something that lasts longer. And in the NBA, longevity is power. Consistency is power. Adaptability is power. And those things do not always show up early, but when they do, they change everything. So can Cooper Flagg be better than Wembanyama? If you define better by what you see right now, the answer probably feels it. But if you define better by what survives pressure, adapts over time, and still works when everything else breaks down, then this is not a crazy debate. It is just an uncomfortable one. Because it forces you to question what you value more, the player who bends the game, or the player who understands it completely. And if history tells us anything, it is that the answer is rarely the one that looks the most obvious at the beginning. So the real question is not whether Flagg can catch Wembanyama. It is whether we are too focused on the wrong things to notice if he already is. If you want more stories that break down the truth behind the hype, stay here. Because the next superstar debate is never as simple as it looks.